Old Nan has had a major impact on many of the main characters in A Song of Ice and Fire by telling them stories as they grew up as children. There are references to Old Nan in the point of views of every Stark child, but no one more so than Bran. When we're being told stories by Old Nan, we're sitting in Bran's head. All of the quotes by Old Nan are in conversations between her and Bran. And, of course, Bran is the one who's visiting all of the scary locations that he was told about in Old Nan's stories. For example, all of the stories she told him about the Night Fort give plenty of context as the group passes through there on their way north of the Wall. Then, when they meet Cold Hands or the Children of the Forest, the first thing that comes to Bran's mind is an Old Nan story. So she's obviously had an impact on many of the characters, but when we think about her impact, most of the time we're thinking about her impact on Bran. And very specifically, the impact of her stories on Bran. Because when they do have conversations, she's either actively telling him a story, or she's chatting about the idea of stories, such as when she tells him, "Stories wait, my little lord, and when you come back to them, why, there they are. Visitors are not so patient, and oft times they bring stories of their own." So you can see that this woman is very obsessed with stories, and the idea of coming back to stories and them still being there waiting for you is very interesting. Because when I was thinking about Bran's storyline and where it has to go, and a little bit about what we saw happen in the television show, well, I started to realize maybe these stories are going to come back in a way that I didn't even realize before. If what I'm going to talk about today is actually what George is planning, well, then it's been incredibly well set up since the beginning of the first book. And it would sort of make sense of why Tyrion was talking about stories in Bran's coronation. I'm not trying to defend how they handled it in the show, there was not really a through line about stories in Bran's story in the television show. But if you look at it in the books, the idea of stories is actually like one of the core things that's being explored in Bran's story. But okay, we're going to put a pin in that for a second so that I can stop saying the word story, and we're going to talk about what exactly needs to happen next for Bran and where these things could all become relevant again. So, remembering where we left off with Bran in the books, he has basically just started his magical training montage. He's with the Three Eyed Crow, Bloodraven, at the cave. He's becoming wed to the trees, and there's going to be a lot of things that he needs to learn and a lot of things that he needs to see. I would say it's nearly unanimously agreed upon by the fans that Bran's arc will involve some viewing things through the Weirwoods and some sort of magical training and learning that's going to be coming up next. In the show, the way that they handled this training when Bran was at this point in his story was essentially he was guided by the Three Eyed Crow through several visions, and they were just physically like walking together, and he was essentially being shown specific things by the Three Eyed Crow. Then, at some point in this process, but before Bran's training was complete, something magical happened that allowed the others to get in and kill the Three Eyed Crow, and this essentially left Bran on his own. At that point, Bran was completely lost, he had no more guide, and he wasn't yet fully ready to do everything he needed to do. The way the show resolved this conflict, if I recall correctly, was he just crawled up to a weirwood and then like put his hand to the face, received a big download, and then like fully ascended to being the three-eyed crow. We can assume that he saw whatever he needed to see in that last final vision, which there was a vision that was included with the download. And so I think that what the show was basically trying to tell us is like, hey, this is Bran's full final level up, and he's downloading whatever information the Weirwoods have to give him. I do think there could be something similar that does eventually happen in the books where Bran, like, takes on a giant chunk of the Weirwood consciousness and sort of loses himself in the process. But I don't think it's necessarily going to all play out the way the show did it. I don't want to go down like a huge rabbit hole about how the show could have done things differently in this video, but one thing that I do want to say that I think the show could have gotten right, and that I think might actually happen in the books, is this period where essentially Bran is on his own, but he's not completed his training and he's not seen everything he needs to see. In the books, the way that Bloodraven is presented, he is barely clinging to life. It wouldn't even necessarily require the others to fully invade the cave to take him out. But I think that might in the end actually happen. I'm just saying, like, there are many plausible scenarios that you could see where Bloodraven could croak, leaving Bran without a guide and essentially having to figure out everything on his own. You can pick your favorite way that this could end up happening, but the reason that I think it might happen is mostly a story reason. I think that it would make for an incredibly good story beat, and it would be a very interesting, like, darkest before the dawn moment where Bran has finally, like, gotten to the cave, he's gotten to the wizard, the master who's supposed to teach him everything, and what always has to happen in these great fantasy stories, Well, the master has to die. This is just like part of the storytelling in general, right? Like you meet this master who's got all this power, he teaches you how to use the power, but if he doesn't die at some point, well, then it's not really the hero's story. It's the story of that master who's got more power who can go and do the thing. But if that guy gets taken out, well, then suddenly your hero, who's not yet ready to take on this power, is the one who's thrown into it, and that's what makes the story so interesting. So just from like a completely removed storytelling perspective, it does make a lot of sense that Bloodraven will probably die at some point in this story, and Bran is probably still going to be at a point where he's not completely yet sure of what he needs to do, because that would just make things more interesting and give him another problem to solve. Obi-Wan didn't get to fully complete Luke's training before he was killed. Gandalf didn't get to give the Fellowship like a long to-do list of his entire plan before he fell in Moria. So I don't think it's very likely that Bloodraven's going to get to complete Bran's training and give him every bit of information that he could need before something inevitably happens. We could get a classic George R. R. Martin subversion of the trope, but if we do, I think it'd be more likely to be in the form of something like, oh, the master doesn't die, Bloodraven and the children turn out to be evil, and rather than the cave being taken over, Bran and company need to escape. That could be the George twist that happens, but in any case, the idea of Bran at some point or another being cut off from Bloodraven with still more to learn is a scenario that I think is likely to happen, so that's what we're going to explore now. Given that this is going to be in probably The Winds of Winter, which George has said is going to be the darkest book in the series, this is not going to be a happy time for Bran. It's probably going to be him and Mira, potentially the only survivors of the cave, out there in the snow, shivering, thinking that they are definitely going to die, and that Bran's definitely going to fail. As I said, this will be the darkest before the dawn moment, and with it being George R. R. Martin, I assume it's going to be very dark. Now seems like a good time to take a moment to also recognize that what Bran is doing when he's looking through the weirwoods is called dreaming. He is green dreaming or green seeing, but he's essentially sleeping while he's doing this. So you have this terrified kid who you need to get to go to sleep as the world is seemingly ending around him, and he needs to dream about specific things. Well, what do you do to get him to go to bed? You tell him a bedtime story. And this is where the realization is maybe dawning on you the way that it dawned on me. If you were to take a list of all of the things that Bran would maybe need to learn, but maybe has not yet been shown by Bloodraven, and then you were to take a list of all of the stories that Old Nan told Bran, those lists match up incredibly well. To the point where if Bran was literally just to systematically go in his green dreams and visit all of the sites of the stories that we are confirmed Old Nan has told him about, I think he would come away with all of the information that he would probably need to figure out what's going on. So obviously what you think Bran needs to learn to solve the problems by the end of the story depends on what you think the problems actually are and what you think is going on magically in these books. The problems with the magic, the seasons, the weirwoods, the others, on some level or another seem to be Bran's to solve. So you're free to run your own calculations of how well you think Old Nan's stories line up with what Bran's gonna need to see, but let's just try to attack this on a ground level by starting with what they showed in the television show and what Bran needed to learn there. I'm not doing this because I think the show was necessarily accurate as to what Bran will actually need to see, but it's more so once you break down the categories of things Bran was shown in the show, they line up with the categories of things that I think Bran will need to learn in the books pretty well. I would say that Bran in the show had three different categories I would put his visions and training into. The first one would be the creation of the others, which he was shown involved the Weirwoods and the Children of the Forest in that vision with the guy tied to the Weirwoods by the Children of the Forest. I do think that this is something that Bran will be shown in the books as well. It just makes sense that that's the person who's going to have to investigate how the others were created in the first place, so definitely that is on the checklist. And just to be clear, I'm saying Bran will see how the others were created or like the process behind the old ways magic, how all of this stuff works. I'm not saying he's going to see someone tied to a tree and stabbed, just that figuratively, he is going to witness the same process in the books. And, luckily, thanks to all the bedtime stories Old Nan was telling Bran, he is obsessed with the Children of the Forest, the Night Fort, the Night King, the Pact, the Green Men, the Isle of Faces. All of these things are things that Bran has become obsessed with repeatedly by being told about them before he goes to sleep at night. Old Nan has planted all of the seeds for Bran to go and learn whatever he needs to learn about any of those subjects. And I would say all of those things fall into the category of like the weirwood old godsy magic that Bran needs to learn. Old Nan has perfectly set him up for all of it. Even if his guide was taken away right now, I think Bran would learn all of this stuff purely from the influence of Old Nan's stories. So that category of the visions is like a slam dunk in my opinion, stuff that in the show they probably didn't want to go through like explaining all of the old Nan stories and how Bran was like following them in his dreams. They simplified it and just had Bloodraven guide him. But in the books, I think it'll probably be the old Nan stories. Also, just thinking out loud here, the actor for Bran looked about 20 by the time season 8 was rolling around, whereas in the books he's still like a little child. So him like cowering and asking for a bedtime story as like a full-grown adult would have probably looked a bit weird compared to Bran doing it in the books. So maybe that's part of the reason it didn't happen this way in the show. That's a creative decision that kind of on that level would make a bit of sense, sort of like him having a sled rather than riding on Hodor's back, just because like you can't physically be carrying around an adult man in a backpack, but Bran in the books is a child still. So anyway, back to the stories that that child is obsessed with. Then the next major thing that Bran was shown in a vision was the Tower of Joy, where he was shown it again guided by Bloodraven, but then he pulled him away for whatever reason. He's just like, "No, you're not ready yet." It was feels a little bit like it was just the show being like, audience, you're not ready yet." But it doesn't really make sense that that would be how it would go. But is there a story that Bran was told that would set up perfectly him seeing exactly what happened at the Tower of Joy? Yes, there is. Bran was told the story of the Night of the Laughing Tree. This is why I said stories are super important throughout Bran's entire arc. As he's traveling with Jojen and Mira, they have a massive conversation about this story. They tell him the story, he says what a great story it is, and then they ask, "Are you sure you've never heard this story before?" And they're very surprised that he hadn't, because it's a story about, Howland and probably Lyanna, and so they're surprised that his father didn't tell him the story. So now, just like we brought up the old Nan bedtime stories in the context of Bran being alone, completely without a guide, having no idea what to do, and being scared out in the snow, well, you have Mira there with him. Imagine the scenario where they're freezing to death essentially around a fire out in the snow, and she's just trying to do anything she can to keep up Bran's spirits. One thing she might try is telling him that bedtime story that he really liked before, The Night of the Laughing Tree, a story that should inspire him to keep fighting, bring back some happy memories, maybe. Something that could just remind even her of happier times when she's hearing the story from her father, right? This is the perfect type of thing that I could see George just pulling up, and all of the sudden, what's happening? So they're talking about the Night of the Laughing Tree. Bran eventually does fall asleep, and then suddenly he's green dreaming about the tourney at Harrenhal, and we're finally getting to witness it in all of its glory, which is something that I think readers would very much look forward to, and I think George might actually want to show us. So, whatever information we do get about the tourney of Harrenhal, the Night of the Laughing Tree, I think this could be the perfect entrance point. A story told to Bran before he goes to bed. And then obviously we can follow Rhaegar and Lyanna from the Night of the Laughing Tree point, all the way through if they stay on the Isle of Faces, get married, which Bran saw them get married in the show, and then all the way through to the Tower of Joy. The stories are the entry point for Bran to learn everything that he was shown and everything that's super relevant. Once Bran's there, the curiosity takes over, and assuming he knows how with his Weirwood powers, he can go back once he knows where he's trying to go with the Weirwoods and he can see what he needs to see. Once Bran is actually in the past witnessing the events that he's interested in, he'll stay there. But if his guide is taken out early enough in the process where he doesn't even really know yet what he needs to be looking for, he still needs a way to accidentally get there that's well set up. There's always a story that's a perfect way in. So this story is a little unique that it doesn't come from Old Nan, but it is a major early plot point in Bran's story, and it's a very major point, and Mira could still be there to tell it, so like all of it lines up. This entire second category of things Bran was shown in the show, all around Jon, the Tower of Joy, the Rhaegar Lyanna stuff, there's a perfect story entry point for that as well. Also, just jumping quickly in here to mention that I had completely forgotten, the context of the Night of the Laughing Tree story being told was literally that Bran is being sad about old Nan. He's sad that she might be dead, he's thinking about her stories, and then he asks the Reeds, "Do you know any stories?" and then they're continuing to talk about Old Nan as they get into telling the story. So even though this isn't an Old Nan story, Old Nan has a direct effect on this story being brought up in the first place. And the story is brought up in basically the context that I expect it may be brought up again, when Bran is sad and he wants a story to make him feel better. Then, unless I'm missing something, the final category I would say is just everything else. Bran gets that final vision of just everything else, and then suddenly he becomes like Robo Bran. At this point, I think you could pretty much also just consider this category leftovers, like anything else that you could consider Bran potentially needing to go back into the past and learn. Just take a look yourself and be like, okay, is there an old Nan story that Bran heard before bed that would be perfect to make him dream about this? And the answer, as far as I've found so far, has been yes. Or at the very least, there's a dream to get him in, and then that information is further down the rabbit hole, right? Like if he starts dreaming about the Night King, maybe suddenly he's like witnessing ancient events in the past and he's following them from one to another. But the stories, as I said again, are just the entry point. Let me know down in the comments if there's anything that you think Bran might need to learn about, and what story potentially he could have been told that could be like his entryway down the rabbit hole. I think that all of this old godsy stuff is well connected enough that you could draw a line from a lot of different old Nan stories to a lot of different things that Bran could potentially go back and see. If you have someone who you talk about A Song of Ice and Fire with and you buy this idea, maybe share this video with them because I think it'd be cool to get the fandom and the hive mind to sort of take a look at mapping out Bran's potential path in the Winds of Winter from bedtime stories to dreams into the ancient past and to the revelations that we all eventually want to get from him. This is one of those videos I was really excited to make and see what people say down in the comments because it just completely changes the way I look at all of these different stories that Bran's been told throughout this entire series so far. Also, to me, for just the reasons that I said earlier about how core this is to Bran's story arc, like the mentor dies, oh no, what's he gonna do? You need the solution to be well set up in the beginning, and if the solution is all of these stories that were mentioned in book one, I just think that, like, there are things about the story arc, especially of Bran, that George probably didn't change from his original outline, and this could definitely be one of them. All of the pieces are there, it's well set up in the beginning, all of the stuff about stories being there when you come back for them, all of that stuff, if you read it in this context and then you look at how in season 8 of the show, for some reason they needed to include the idea of stories in Bran's coronation, it just makes a lot of sense under this context. I do think that this is one of those things that's just so well set up in the first book that it's pretty likely to me that this is a core part of George's outline. Bran's arc is going to have a main point that stories are a major solution to one of his problems. Stories were a very important part of Bran's arc in the beginning of the books. When you look for it, it is there consistently. They're important throughout his story. They are important in the end of his arc in the television show. I think that George has done this all for a reason. He has given Bran a power that has been compared to dreaming, which Bran can use to go and visit all of these different places in the past. And to get him into his dreams, he has been given a list of favorite bedtime stories that directly line up with all of the locations that Bran is going to need to visit. I don't think that George R. R. Martin has done that by accident. There is a reason that stories are important in Bran's arc, and this is why. Old Nan's bedtime stories are going to be the thing that will guide a rudderless and defeated and terrified Bran to all of the information that he's going to need to save the world in the end. Or, maybe it's all just a big coincidence. Up for you to decide. Thank you very much for watching. Remember to like and subscribe. I'll be back with something else very soon.